Tonight, we wouldn't chase myths about golden serpents or count the stars that pretend to guard a tomb. Instead, we'll sit where ink still breathes, under a lamp that burns slower than thought. The air smells of papyrus and Nile dust, patient and unhurried. Each line here was meant to be whispered, not read. Each word knows the cost of being spoken twice. Somewhere in the corner, a reed pen waits beside a bowl of water, its shadow already practicing restraint. The scribes of the House of Life wrote as if silence were watching over their shoulders, and perhaps it was. So lower the lights. Let the warmth of the lamp press gently against your skin, and if your breathing begins to follow the slow rhythm of the river outside, that's the scroll remembering you. Somewhere in that quiet rhythm, footsteps return soft at first, then sure, like history remembering the weight it used to carry. The night exhales dust and direction. The air thickens with the scent of honey, linen, and command. You follow it past empty gates and sleeping statues until the sand begins to sound like a road again. That's where the story truly starts, with a body, a convoy, and the patient ambition of a road that knows where empires go to rest. The House of Life has the comfortable habits of an elderly cat. It knows the warm spots of the floor, and it pretends not to notice mice of gossip that run along the baseboards. The door opens in the morning with a scrape that could be a greeting. Inside, there is the breath of ink, not the sharp smell of modern pigment, but the faint sweetness of soot mixed with gum. The bundles on the shelf are tied with string the color of dust. Each has a clay seal, pressed by a signet that shows a falcon's eye, and the eye is slightly off-center because the seal maker had tea on his mind that day. The lock is more ceremony than barrier. The real lock is the scribe who remembers what was read and who read it, and whether the reader was as respectful as a well-behaved shadow. Inventories are spoken before they are written, as if the voice is the ribbon that keeps thought from fluttering away. The clerk's chant includes useful things, medical charms for stubborn fevers, star lists that turn the sky into a calendar, and less useful things like how many times a certain line has been copied without a mistake. The number is higher than you think and lower than it needs to be. They whisper that there is a particular role which is not counted with the rest. It lives behind a curtain that is not there to hide it, only to remind it to be quiet. The rumor moves in sandals. It has a sensible pace, and it never trips over the hem of its own importance. This scroll, the whisper says, can wake stones. It can make birds forget their manners and speak about the weather in full sentences. It can teach the tongue to address canals as if they were cousins. None of this is necessary for a productive life, which is why it is fascinating. Ancient cities were full of necessary things: grain tallies, tax notes, lists of who borrowed which robe and did not return it. A scroll about the speech of fish is comfortably unnecessary. Still, the House of Life has a policy about it, as libraries always do. The policy is brief, as if brevity were itself a ritual. Read it once, never twice, and only before noon, when the shadows are awake enough to listen. The policy is probably older than the scroll. Policies often are. The rule is enforced by habits rather than guards. A stool is set at the right height. A bowl of water sits where a hand can find it without looking. A window is latched to hush the wind, because a word is a delicate boat and drafts will steer it. The reed pens are cut square, and the knife that cuts them is satisfied with its work. The reader is chosen by a process so ordinary it becomes sacred. Whoever has been the most punctual for the last 7 days. Punctuality, it turns out, is a kind of priesthood. The selected reader warms the voice with harmless syllables, counting breath like beads. He or she reads the dangerous lines as if carrying soup across a floor with uneven tiles. One step, a pause, another step. The text does not shout. It has never raised its voice. It doesn't need to. On the second line, the small birds that perch on the eaves slow their blinking, which is not proof, but is close. On the third, a statue in the courtyard looks like a listener who has decided not to interrupt. That too is not proof, but it is a pleasant coincidence. The canal outside rearranges its ripples. The reader keeps going because the ritual promises that the world will behave if the voice does. What the text gives is never the same twice, which is convenient for scholars who enjoy footnotes. A fisherman later reports that the water remembered where the shallows begin and told his feet in soft pushbacks. A gardener says the orange trees leaned as if they could hear about rain arriving from somewhere that has not yet chosen to exist. Stars, which have a reputation for minding their own business, respond to their older names, the ones written when maps were still sketches of dreams. The city does not transform. It merely cooperates more elegantly. It is the difference between a door that opens and a door that opens without squeaking. The scroll seems to oil the hinges. No miracles, just reduced friction. You would think such minor improvements would put the text on the required reading list, but the House of Life remains stubborn. Anything that changes the world, even by a hair, should be handled as if the hair were a cobra. This is the era's version of an advanced settings menu. Useful, but better left alone, unless you absolutely know what you are doing. No one absolutely knows. The price for reading is written between the lines where most fees prefer to live. The first payment is sleep. It arrives on time, yet refuses to leave at the appointed hour. The reader wakes as if the body remembered a different sunrise. Familiar rooms tilt by a degree, as if the house has become a ship, and the ship has become a thought that wants to drift. Ink stains remain on the fingers longer than ink ought to, as if the letters are unwilling to let go. Names feel heavier in the mouth, like coins that have been in too many palms. Dreams repeat one phrase with impeccable diction. This is normal. Dreams like repetition because it looks like certainty. The second payment is attention. The reader's timing becomes the scroll's timing. Noon means nothing if the syllables are not ready. Evening cannot arrive until the last breath lands where the previous readers did. Friends notice the oddness and forgive it without comment, because friends are a kind of counter-ritual. There are known countermeasures, collected over years in a margin small enough to ignore, large enough to save you. Put a bowl of water within reach of the elbow. Water listens without arguing and anchors speech in the room where it belongs. Offer bread. Bread is famously calm. Invite a second voice for ballast. The second voice does not read the dangerous lines. It supplies a harmless hymn about goats or a list of weights, or the sequence of months as spoken by an ant who enjoys calendars. The scroll does not mind. It appreciates duet as any melody does. When the reading ends, the papyrus is wrapped with knots counted aloud 3, or 5, never 4. 4 is not unlucky. It is simply too even, and even numbers have the bad habit of marching off together. The knots are tiny decisions tied into fiber, small no's that keep the big yes from spilling. What cannot be undone is written in tidy hand as a reminder for the future reader who will ignore it and then remember it with gratitude. You may be wondering why anyone continues with a text that fills in sleep and collects in oddness. Libraries quietly ask the same question about half their catalogs and keep them anyway. Knowledge, even fidgety knowledge, likes a shelf. And there is the rumor, always the rumor, that the dangerous lines are not merely about birds and canals. Some claim that if you read with exactly the right breath, a door in stone will move itself to the left by the width of a finger. Not open. That would be impolite. Just move aside a little, like a thoughtful neighbor on a crowded staircase. Others swear that footprints in a courtyard sand could be made to misremember where they were walking from. This is attractive to officials who prefer tidy reports. It is also attractive to anyone who has ever spilled wine. Museums shall be grateful later, without saying why. The House of Life refuses to confirm any of this. It posts a polite notice instead. Please read slowly. It does not clarify whether the slowness is for the reader's sake or the city's. When the price begins to feel like ownership, the text must be hidden for a while. Books, like cats again, sometimes require a nap away from people. Hiding a scroll is more art than engineering. Locks in this climate age like fruit. They are good for a few weeks and then turn philosophical. The favored method is river logic. A cedar chest is tarred until the smell assures you that it loves water more than it loves air. Linen lines the inside in neat layers. The roll is tucked there, cocooned like a season waiting to be named. The chest is slipped into reeds exactly where the bank is slightly disorganized. Scorpions are asked to keep watch, and, being practical creatures, they agree without paperwork. A temple boy with precise handwriting notes the place on a star map because the river has a habit of editing shorelines while the city is asleep. The notation is not a dot. It is the angle between two stars and a remark about a crooked tamarisk. You could find it a century later if you knew the remark and the angle and what a tamarisk looks like after a century of learning to be unremarkable. Retrieval is not planned. It is owed. Someone in the future will need the scroll for reasons as tidy as an accountant as joy or as messy as a king's request. When that someone arrives, the city moves a little to help. A mason remembers that a wall has always been a little warmer in the afternoon. A boatman claims the current grows curious near a certain bend. A woman in the market knows where scorpions like the sound of sandals. Finding is never dramatic. It is a chain of nods. The chest comes up with patient bubbles. The linen unfolds with a sigh that might be Tar thinking about philosophy again. And the papyrus complains the way old paper does, like a person who only enjoys being unfolded by someone who remembers their birthday. The knots are unpicked while someone, by habit, counts them. The bowl of water is there already because common sense is the only magic that never fails, and bread waits its turn to be the quietest object in the room. A hypothesis for bedtime delivered without urgency. Some books protect cities by refusing to be present. The world is full of rescue that looks like absence. We do not allow the scroll to become furniture. Furniture gets dusted and leaned on and forgotten. Archives are different. They are rooms that choose their guests. When the text is not read, it remains a possibility, folded like a map you are not using because you are already home. And if, on some evening that would rather be a morning, someone must read it again, they will do so patiently. They will use the stool at the right height. They will sip water that remembers rivers. They will place bread where hunger can see it and become polite. They will speak the lines as if spelling their own name on a fogged window. The birds outside will comment on the weather in case anyone is keeping track. The canal will look interested and then pretend it always knew. The statue will face forward, not in surprise, but in professional courtesy. While the house breathes, we let ourselves drift with its rhythm. The scribe scratches a date in the margin, in a hand that prefers squares to curves. He adds a dot because the dot was there yesterday and might wonder if it has been abandoned. He sets the reed down as if it has earned a nap. Someone presses the seal into a neat circle of wet clay and rotates it a little to make the falcon's eye more central this time. It is still a little off. The curtain falls into place, not as punishment, but as shade. The latch settles. Somewhere very far from this room, and also very near, a temple calendar turns a tooth forward and says, with bureaucratic satisfaction, that the day has been added to the correct pile. The scroll remains unheroic on its shelf, which is the safest kind of magic. The reader's hand, still a little stained, cools against the bowl. The water's surface stills, the tiny waves forgetting they were ever ambitious. The city stays the city. It enjoys the policy of quiet. Outside, the Nile taps stone with a sound that thinks it is a clock. It is not a clock. It is simply the river attending carefully to edges. Sand learns again to be ordinary. The market shutters deflate like lungs that have remembered bedtime. A boat creaks in a language wood uses when it complains pleasantly. If you have stayed awake this long, you are now an honorific scribe of the calmer kind, the sort who copies nothing and still fills the page. You may subscribe for more night shift history, or not. The scroll will not mind. The House of Life certainly will not. It approves of people who decide very slowly. Lamp stem. Names, heavy with use, go into their boxes and sleep arranged alphabetically. The room writes itself by that one decree. The curtain remembers it is a curtain and not a boundary. Somewhere in the reed marsh, a cedar chest listens to frogs and keeps its secrets so lightly that it almost isn't a secret, just a courtesy. We let the breath fall into its own pace, which is older than any rule, and we do the most ancient countermeasure of all. We close our eyes and agree to be quiet while the lesson keeps itself. You might not expect a crooked piece of wood to run an economy, but for a few quiet centuries, a lot of money lived on sticks. The bark did most of the privacy work. A tally looked almost bored with itself, which was helpful. No one felt nervous passing a fortune when it resembled kindling. A clerk warmed a small knife in his palm and breathed on the wood the way you fog a window to write your name. The notch went in with the gentleness of a sigh. No flourish, no drum roll, just a small V where none had been before. One notch meant one thing today and a slightly different thing yesterday, which is how tradition earns its wrinkles. The wood remembered both better than paper did. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you're welcome to subscribe to more extremely calm financial instruments, but do it later. The tally will wait. They are patient by nature and frankly bad at reminders. The trees were chosen politely. Willow and hazel like to grow where feet must cross water. Alders didn't mind wet ankles. Clerks liked them all, but hazel made a clean sound when cut, an almost musical snip that told you the fibers had agreed. A stick was about the length from clerk's wrist to elbow, because offices measure things by the nearest available limb. Each stick was squared badly on purpose, so it wouldn't roll off the table and try to become firewood before its career began. A quill scratched a name along the face, Godfrey or Agnes or Her Majesty, but the true words were inside the wood in those little valleys. The clerk's knife made notches with personalities. A shallow nick for pennies, a deeper bite for shillings, a full, decisive trench for £1. There were also decorative flourishes, playful as a cat walking across the ledger. Some counties drew a cross beside the longer cuts, as if blessing the arithmetic. Others preferred a simple dot, the punctuation of a quiet office. The genius of the tally was its habit of being two at once. After the notches were cut, the clerk split the stick lengthwise with a controlled crack that sounded like winter in a small field. The split was not a break. It was a cunning divorce with visitation rights. The bigger half the stock stayed with the treasury or the warehouse that made the debt. The slimmer half the foil went home with the person who had handed over grain or coins or patience. The two halves matched along their broken face with the intimacy of a puzzle. Every splinter was a signature. You could fake the notches, but you could not fake the fracture. It was, in a sleepy way, beautiful. Contracts can be poetic and still be binding. The tally knew this and nodded along. If you joined the stick too often just for fun, the clerk would cough and look at the window. The implied message was ancient and clear. Wood wears out, and so does trust. Payment days were soft weather days, if they could be. No one likes arguing when rain finds its way down collars. The trestle table was sensitively sticky with long use. Over it hung a list that was more reassurance than instruction. Remember to bring the correct half. Remember to bring the person attached to the name written on the side. Remember that notches count even when the elbow insists it has improved. People queued with the equanimity of millstones. They propped their foils like umbrellas against the wall and admired each other's splinters. This was the original social network. Very little happened, everything was witnessed. When your turn arrived, the clerk slid the two halves together. Sometimes they kissed immediately, wood remembering wood with an almost smug click. Sometimes they hesitated. The clerk would rotate his half in a slow circle, as if courting a coy hinge. At last the faces met. If the tally refused to mate, the room did not accuse. Someone had shaved a notch, perhaps, or a cousin had borrowed the wrong stick to stir stew. The explanation would be humbly domestic. Fraud is a dramatic word. Most days it merely looks like a kitchen. In the back rooms, where tallies leaned like a small forest that had learned accounting, rules accumulated one sensible leaf at a time. Never stack tallies of the same name in the same corner. A mouse might take a liking to Godfrey, and the whole county would lose faith at supper. Keep fire away from clusters of debt, because fire loves shortcuts. Don't lend knives to visitors who say they just want to sharpen them. They always do, but it is not the point. And if a tally is split again by accident, do not attempt surgery. You will create a third party, and the law can only respect so many people in one piece of wood. There were also notes about the smell of old sticks. Some retained a ghost of river where the tree had stood. Others carried faint cider from having spent time as a temporary prop in a tavern. Clerks did not mind. Accounts with cents were easier to remember. The strangest thing about tally sticks was their comfort with travel. Paper likes desks, wood likes journeys. A farmer walked with his foil tucked in his belt as if it were a slim tool for an unknown repair. A mercer kept his in the breast of his coat, where it warmed to the shape of a plan. Monarchs had theirs bound with ribbon and stored like ceremonious bookmarks behind the throne. One king's household had a footman whose entire job was to remember which box contained which bundle of notched evidence that the realm functioned. He had shoulders like patience and a cough that sounded like rain on a slate roof. The court called him the forester, which was both affectionate and not helpful. When a war swallowed supplies faster than promises could be written, the treasury issued tallies so vigorously the knife became hot. People accepted them. Wood from the riverbank turned into arrows and bread and wages, which is alchemy enough for a weekday. At markets, tallies settled arguments more gently than voices could. Two butchers who had forgotten who owed what pressed their halves together the way children compare stones. The notches winked and said, without judgment, that one man's memory was an enthusiastic fiction. Millers who trusted wheat and distrusted everything else, liked tallies because the stick weighed nothing in the scale. Sailors who distrusted everything liked them because the wood could survive a wet pocket. You could not persuade ink that had gone for a swim to speak again, but a stick remembered even when it fancied itself driftwood. Tavern keepers who understood human arithmetic, one more drink equals one more story, kept little foil collections on a nail by the door. Regulars would point to their splinters when short of coins. The ledger, meanwhile, was mostly decorative, the handwriting having been replaced gradually by a series of spills that refused to adopt a phonetic system. The law liked tallies until it disliked them. Law is moody. Judges enjoyed the physical act of reconciliation. Half meets half, contract reconstituted like bread dipped in soup. Juries nodded at the common sense of it. But then a counterfeit case bothered everyone. A clever person trimmed a notch, or perhaps trimmed their own conscience, and appeared with something that almost matched. Almost is an unforgiving word in court. The judge, who had never been good at whittling, suspected wizardry. Regulations grew like ivy, stronger in the shade. Notches must be cut before witnesses. Names must be written on the angle, not the flat, because angles age more cooperatively. The stock half must never leave the chest. The foil must be shown again at harvest, even if nothing has happened. It is charming how often the nothingness of a year requires ceremony. Fires taught a terrible lesson calmly. Everyone knew tallies and heat were poor companions, but everyone also liked tidy storage. In the great tally rooms of a city that preferred pageantry to common sense, the old sticks piled up until they resembled a museum of past promises hushed by dust. An official decided to clean. He brought order and a cheerful brazier. The room taught him why archives deserve shade. The tallies did what seasoned wood does. They remembered they were trees and leaped upward in a swarm of flame that sounded like applause. Stone cracked, ceilings exhaled themselves, and a great number of agreements turned to foamless smoke. The city rebuilt its paperwork with bleary eyes. Afterward, clerks kept fewer sticks, and some developed a private superstition that promises should never be warmer than a hand. The superstition was very reasonable. By then, paper had grown bolder and multiplied. Quills felt important and left dashing tails on their toes. Seals pressed wax with little animals that could not keep secrets. Additions were easier on a page. Subtractions were tidier. Still, tally sticks refused to become folklore quite yet. In remote warehouses where mice respected a stern glance, you could still find them leaning politely in corners, elderly, content. Once in a while, a visitor would pull two halves together and smile at the exactness of the fit, how the broken faces held each other with the confidence of old friends who meet after years and resume a sentence at the comma. Museums began to ask for them the way museums ask for everything, carefully, as if requesting to borrow time. The clerks granted these requests because the world had become very fond of glass cases. Behind glass, even a stick can look philosophical. If you listen closely, the tallies tell you something about the human preference for moderate difficulties. Coins are simple, ledgers are complicated. A split piece of wood is both, which feels honest. It let a money system operate at a humane speed. We paid, we waited, we pressed our halves together, we nodded. We went home to stew or to sleep. There were no push notifications beyond the quiet complaint of a stick falling over behind the chest. There was no two-factor authentication beyond the shape of a break. The most thrilling innovation most weeks was a new way of carving the pound notch, so it would not be mistaken for 2 shillings standing suspiciously close. To modern eyes, this looks like inefficiency. To sleepier eyes, it looks like wisdom. The accounting moved slowly enough that life could continue around it without always checking its pockets. One of the smallest micro-controversies in the world of tallies involves direction. Some pennies notched from the tip toward the middle, others from the middle toward the tip. Arguments about North or South England threatened to bloom, then wilted immediately because everyone grew bored at the same moment. Music scholars later pointed out that readers of lute tablature work in the same split manner, and merchants can be very musical when given enough time. A few monasteries, delighted by parallels, kept a stick to mark how many times the bell rope had been replaced, because ropes, like economies, fray slowest when nobody pays attention to them. People use tallies for things no law imagined. Lovers who know that documentation is either dangerous or delicious sometimes exchanged miniature sticks with notches that meant nothing at auto 1 for a shared pair 2 for a secret path to whispering 3 for a look given and remembered. A child noticing tried the same with a dog and discovered that dogs consider everything paid in advance. A traveling physician notched the number of fevers that broke on a cool night and kept the foil tucked behind a saint card. Not because the card cured anything, but because it fit perfectly and perfection can be a quiet comfort. A town baker who always forgot where she had set her best peel marked the loan on a stick and placed it above the oven. With heat below and memory above, the peel always returned eventually, browned a little along its edges, as if embarrassed but willing to remain. The old system slipped into the new centuries without warning. Banks grew into buildings that taught echoes to behave. Accountants traded knives for pens with steel nibs that made opinions about paper quality. But if you peer behind the counter, time keeps leaving its wooden hints. Receipts still tear with that satisfying, not quite straight fuzz that is the paper equivalent of a fracture face. Tickets print in pairs and are separated with a serration that remembers somebody once thought two halves should only tell the truth when together. The person who designed the checkbox had a tally hidden in their pocket. They would deny it, of course. Most good ideas are embarrassed by their ancestors. When a final warehouse in a final village decided it no longer needed its bundle of half-debts and whole stories, the clerk called the school children. He had read about exhibits and field trips and thought it would be nice if the sticks performed one last service before becoming firewood, not to be burned, just to be discussed. He lined them on a table like a little wooden choir. The children lifted the foils. They pressed them to the stalks and made reunion after reunion. A soundless click each time, a wooden applause, but for accuracy rather than achievement. One boy asked if you could make new notches if you were certain the old ones had been miscounted by someone who didn't know what a shilling felt like. The clerk, who liked honest questions, said you could, but then the two faces would not trust each other anymore. The boy nodded and decided that numbers had personalities the way doors have moods. No one argued. The afternoon drifted like flour in a bakery. Ethnographies, when they appear, always arrive with notebooks full of rectangular boxes waiting for lists. A visitor to that village wrote, "The tally stick is a memory machine that refuses to be clever." It is a kind remark. Clever machines try to predict you. The tally simply agrees to remember what you said, and then it reminds both parties later with a quiet fit of edges. In a museum, a label will say hazel split, notched, and nearby will sit objects that look louder, coins stamped with lions, documents shouting Latin. People will pass and think, perhaps, about the way a notch looks like a small open mouth. Some will be tempted to count the cuts and reconstruct the debt, a silly exercise because no one wants the past to send an invoice. Others will just like the wood and the idea that once agreements were the color of sunlight on a bench. I sometimes wonder what the world would feel like if we kept a personal tally for time given and time received. The stock would stay with the days themselves, who are notoriously disorganized. The foil would live in our pockets, not as a conscience, just as a friendly splinter. We could press it to a morning and see whether the match is good. If the faces fit poorly, we could try another hour or another task. A notch for a conversation that didn't need an answer. A deeper notch for a walk taken in weather that looked undecided and then did not decide. A full trench for a day that kept its promise and demanded nothing extra. It would make impatience expensive. It would make kindness measurable and then, as always, unimportant to measure. The last tally I saw was in a drawer that had given up keeping track of its contents. There were rubber bands practicing escape, and a key whose door had probably retired, and a feather that had become an argument about whether the drawer was a museum or a nest. The stick was thin, polite, patient. Its notches were shallow, the wood a bit sullen from a century of doing nothing useful. If I pressed it to its better half, wherever that half sits behind glass, under dust, in the pocket of a coat that forgot its owner, the faces would know each other. They would meet, and the room would experience, for half a second, the relief of a debt settled 200 years late. Then it would go back to being a room. Debt and stick and clerk and riverbank would resume their roles as history's sleep aids. We settle into that same comfort now. The knife cools on the dusk. The willow outside copies the old notches into its shadow. If you're still awake, you have bound something by listening. Story against silence, wood against sleep, patience against clocks. We put the stick back where it belongs, in the slow archive of agreed-upon things, and let the night count us with gentle, even cuts until the halves match and the eyes close. You might not expect a library key to feel smug, but the bronze key for the house of life had that kind of personality, softened by years of warm hands and a habit of sighing when it turned. The door knew it too. It liked to creak in a way that made visiting scribes sound more important than they felt. Inside, the air had the polite dust of papyrus and the quiet mint of ink ground with water that had been carried in jars that remembered other rooms. Shelves stood with the posture of temple officials, slightly formal but not unfriendly. On a small table near the entrance lay the inventory string, a humble length of flax that had retired from tying sandals and now tied knowledge. Each time a scroll moved, the string counted not with numbers, but with knots, which is how libraries tell themselves bedtime stories. If you're still awake later, you can subscribe for more extremely gentle descriptions of string. But really, do not hurry. The string has no plans, and neither do we. Scribes came early, the way cats arrive before the human day knows it has begun. They rinsed reed pens in a shallow basin that had seen so many mornings it had lost track of its own reflection. Their first task was not writing, but listening. Papyrus crackles as if trying to say, "I am older than you, please be careful." The scribes listened with the patience of a gardener waiting for dew to make up its mind. Then came the muttering inventory, the words that keep order, hymns to Ra, formulas for fevers, lists of star risings, a surprisingly emotional treatise on the correct angle for a ramp. Everything had its shelf, and its shelf had a seal. The seals were little dome moons baked hard and impressed with images that looked like gossip you could hold. A seal said, "This was open then, and again then," and also that time when the junior scribe came in after lunch and pretended not to touch anything. Silence recorded the rest, and silence is very thorough. On certain afternoons, usually when the Nile wind tapped the outside stones as if rehearsing a festival rhythm, the talk would drift not loud, just comfortably careless toward a rumor. It was a rumor with a good memory and a bad attitude. There was, they said, a book that was not exactly a book, and a scroll that wasn't entirely sure it was a scroll. It promised unusual favors, the language of birds for those who had always wanted to understand why sparrows hold meetings on the roof, the language of fish for those who suspected the river kept minutes of everything, a map of paths underwater for those who disliked waiting for ferries. The promise was thickly carved in the story like a relief on temple wall. You read it once, and doors in stone open like polite jaws. You read it a second time, and the doors shut in a way that involved you. The rule carried a warning me as a legal clause. Once aloud, never twice, and never before noon. Scholars who love rules in the same way bakers love heat repeated it often, partly to remember, partly to test whether the repetition counted as reading. Temptation, meanwhile, kept curfew by the lamp. The house of life had its own geometry. The stool lived near the window because elbows need light. The bowl of water sat a careful distance from everything that would dissolve if startled. The sealed window was never actually opened, a fact that puzzled no one. The window had found its purpose in being a statement rather than an appliance. Breath was measured like steps. This was not superstition so much as ergonomics. Words, when read aloud, travel farther if released on steady air, and scribes did not want wisdom colliding with a sneeze. The reeds had a habit of squeaking when pressed too hard, a good reminder that firmness is not the same thing as volume. When the dangerous scroll was mentioned, voices dropped into the register used for telling a child not to wake a sleeping cat. Everyone knew that one slip meant nothing until meaning decided otherwise. Meaning is a latecomer, often dramatic. The threshold of voice is an odd place. Syllables seem heavier there, as if they have put on their formal sandals and tied them too tight. A reader would test each phrase with a fingertip on the reed, measuring stress the way a boatman measures current by the way a rope hums. The room, as arranged, tried to reduce surprise. That was the decor, less astonishment, more accuracy. Some words are skeptical about furniture, but most accept it. When at last a line crossed the lips, it moved like a careful boat between banks. Those who listened felt the quiet bend around the sound and settle again, like a blanket deciding where to lie. What the text promised when the rumor behaved was generous and slightly impractical, the best sort of education. Birds reported on weather with a confidence that annoyed official calendars. If you learned their grammar, you could tell, by the second clause of a swallow's sentence, whether the wind would arrive in time for evening dates. Statues were worse gossips than birds. They adjusted their attention when addressed in their own tense, and their listening made the air change temperature by the polite thickness of a degree. Canals, if asked correctly, confessed about hidden inlets, shortcuts for barges carrying clay pots that preferred not to clink. Sand remembered footprints it should forget. Stars answered to names older than maps and seemed pleased to be recognized. Power arrived without noise and expected the same from you, like a senior librarian who knows where everything is and has decided to adopt you for the afternoon. But of course the price lived inside the promise the way a thorn lives inside a rose. Not malicious, merely consistent. Sleep came oddly after such reading. It came as if it were tired from traveling a long way, and you were only a convenient bed. A personal name grew heavy. The syllables of it sat down in your chest and said they might move later. Rooms tilted by a degree, which is not enough to cause concern, but enough to make a jar roll toward the door as if practicing escape. Ink clung to the hand that held the reed, not visually, but in intention, as if your fingers had become permanent readers. Dreams repeated phrases the mouth would never risk twice. The worst punishment, to hear the old priest tell it, was not thunderbolts or frogs or rivers turning into anything dramatic. It was timing. The reader's timing became the scroll's timing. Your noon drifted. Your midnight waited behind a corner and then didn't come. You ate breakfast that dignified dusk and felt sensible about it, which is how you recognized that the punishment was working. Scribes invented countermeasures, because that is what scribes do between tasks. Some were almost theological, others as practical as a nap. A basin of water set near the text steadied the room. Water has opinions about equilibrium and enjoys being consulted. A small bread offering nothing elaborate, something a temple mouse could carry home taught the air to think about hospitality instead of verdicts. A second voice, invited to read a harmless hymn immediately after the interesting one, acted as ballast. The hymn did not mind being used this way. Hymns are content with any attention. The scroll, when finished with, was rewrapped with knots counted aloud. 3, then 5, numbers that feel balanced in the hand. And in the margin, a line was always written that said what could not be undone, and meant both more and less than it declared. Margins are where wisdom keeps its coat. Hiding a stubborn book is a delicate art. The house of life knew many places, but secrets prefer particular climates. The riverbank, with its tall reeds that practiced being curtains, offered a shelf no carpenter could measure. A cedar chest, lined with linen softened by years of washing the temple floors, went into the earth to a depth decided by a scribe's ankle and a scorpion's opinion. Scorpions are stern but fair project managers. Tar was painted in patient strokes. The brush did that slow whisper that usually means winter is coming. The chest was lowered, sealed, and then visited at intervals that matched no calendar in all of them. Only a star map could mark the spot, and it did, encoded in the ceiling of a small room where the priests met to discuss whether figs were a theory or a fruit. The map was not labeled in a way anyone would consider helpful. That was on purpose. Helpfulness is how secrets leak. Retrieval, when necessary, came as a favor across years, not a plan across weeks. Some objects function best as obligations owed by the future to the past. There was, as there always is, a bedtime hypothesis. It wandered softly through the house like a cat that forgot where the warm place was. Some books, the hypothesis suggested, protect cities by refusing to be present. If a text contains a door that opens where the city is not ready to walk, The kindest act is to stay unread in a chest that smells faintly of tar and patient cedar. Forgetting becomes a method. Absence becomes an archive. If the scroll is read again, it will be by someone who can count to once, and then stop, someone patient with silence, someone who knows that the languages of birds and fish are useful but not urgent. And if no such reader arrives, the river does not mind another story under its arm. The river keeps everything eventually. The key, still smug, went back on its hook. The hook had become slightly bent by centuries of responsibility, the way responsible people stoop faintly without noticing. Lamps were pinched and exhaled their little bodies of light. The bronze latch sighed the way it had at the beginning, pleased by door work well done. Outside, the Nile tapped stone the way you tap a friend's shoulder in a market to say, "I'm here, walk with me for a bit." The scribe stepped into evening, which had already begun composing its own inventory. Boats, swallows, laundry hung with opinions, the moon rehearsing for later. They were careful not to speak the rumor out loud, not because they feared punishment tonight, but because they disliked giving it any ideas. On the following morning, a junior scribe, optimistic, delicate, the kind of person who apologized to Papyrus, asked how breath could truly be measured like steps. The old reader, who had trained his lungs to have manners, showed him. He tapped the reed gently against his palm to mark syllables. Not as a metronome, exactly, but as a way to remind the mouth that words are parcels and a throat is a road. The junior nodded as if he understood and then forgot immediately, which is the beginning of understanding. They practiced with easy texts, weather reports disguised as hymns. The birds outside improved their enunciation as if enjoying the attention. A heron said something definitive about north wind, and then pretended it hadn't, the way experts sometimes do when their prophecy comes too easily. By midday, the rumor came back wearing a different hat. Someone said the scroll had been written by a god with a fondness for administrative detail. Someone else said it had been copied in a rush by a mortal who misheard the word north as Nile and ruined a city map for 3 generations. These were gentle accusations. The House of Life never punished a story for owning too many versions of itself. After all, the star lists carried 4 different calendars and made them live together like cousins at a wedding. The dangerous thing, the reader reminded the room, was not disagreement, but repetition. Once is an invitation. Twice is a binding. A clever phrase, he added, becomes less clever each time it hears itself. The room enjoyed this, and, as rooms do, kept it. When no one was looking, the wind tried the sealed window. It was the polite kind of wind that expects refusal. The seal declined the offer with the serenity of ritual. Scribes pretended not to notice because noticing would make them consider opening, and considering opening is the first step toward all sorts of afternoons. Instead, they rearranged their shelves very slightly, the way you adjust a cloak on a chair to convince the chair it is dressed and must behave. A scribe set out a new bowl of water and recorded it in the inventory. 1 bowl, many reflections. A practical line, practical lines anchor afternoons. The rumor, which had great stamina for a rumor, also included a promise that a reader could walk beneath water without wetting hair. This was, in the driest sense, an attractive offer. Hair remains the part of a person most opposed to logic. Yet the reader who wanted it most, a boatman's daughter with arms like evidence, stood by the window and decided she liked the old way. Wait for a ferry, speak to the ferryman, pay with coin or favor, learn a small detail about the current, cross. She said nothing, but the choice went through her like a clean line. Sometimes not reading is a kind of knowledge that looks empty and is full. At sunset, the House of Life resembled a sleeping animal with a very regular breathing pattern. Books do that to rooms. In the street, dates were arranged in pyramids that made triangles look like destiny. Children chased a hoop that had opinions about corners. A priest debated softly with a baker about whether flowers of theology. The sky took its color responsibilities seriously and tried 3 different blues before deciding on one that matched everyone's doorways. The dangerous scroll, where it was, continued to be where it was. An unremarkable achievement, and therefore heroic, later weeks or decades. Libraries count time in ellipses, the chest by the river was visited. The stars said the hour had a good posture. The linen wrap was damp in that forgetful way damp things are, as though water had surprised it with a hug. The seal of tar complained and then relented. The scroll inside was the color of old reeds, and the weight of an answer you haven't asked yet. It came into the lamplight and looked at the reader with the casual suspicion of a cat evaluating a lap. The reader did not open it. Instead, in keeping with the hypothesis that absence has a job, he pressed the linen back into shape and tied the knots again, counting 3, then 5 like a nurse humming. He wrote in the margin of the moment, "Not now, for the city's sake," and returned the chest to its shelf in the earth. The river blinked slowly, which is a river's way of blessing. What the scroll can do remains interesting. What it refuses to do is perhaps more useful. Our own lives contain similar volumes, instructions that would make us exact, doors that would open if we timed them like priests, words that would make statues notice us in a way that is flattering only at first. We can read them once, carefully, and then let the margin write its small law. If this sounds like self-help, it is ancient self-help, the best kind entirely free of exclamation points. The birds will still speak about weather. The fish will still record river gossip in their scales. The canals will still hide small inlets for those who prefer their errands without witnesses. You will still dream a dream that repeats, because repetition is how the mind takes attendance. The price will remain what it is, an altered noon, a mouth that measures, a name that sits down and waits to be picked up again. It is not cruel. It is simply administrative, which in temples is nearly the same word as sacred. If you are still with me, eyes slower now, head lighter at the edges, know that the house of life is content to watch you fall asleep. Its inventories are reassuring in the way good baggage claims are. Everything tagged, nothing urgent, a small chance that a scroll will arrive wearing someone else's ribbon and need to be escorted to its true shelf later. The key on the hook will be there in the morning, still pleased with its function, still smug in a friendly way. The latch will sigh because latches like to rehearse. The papyrus will crackle at a respectful volume. The bowl of water will hold the ceiling in its surface as if the sky had to be stored overnight. The rumor will attend the day but not manage it. We leave the room as the lamps shrink to the size of opinions. Outside, the Nile talks in its shoulder voice to the stone bank. A Huron, much more important than any of us, steps into the shallows and forgets what it was going to say, which is an excellent conclusion. The city, unsure whether to be quiet or quieter, chooses the second option. If the scroll punishes, it does so by making us careful and by making noon feel like a friendly rule we have agreed to honor. If the scroll protects, it does so by choosing the gentle labor of hiding. Either way, it is a bedtime object, and we have already learned the first lesson. Once allowed is enough. We tuck that knowledge under the pillow where it can lift the head by a grain of comfort. The river's secret shelf keeps its place. The house of life sleeps in the formal way buildings do. And we let the night do what archives do best, hold everything in place while not asking for comment until morning opens its polite hinges. And the day, patient and well-numbered, invites us to read the ordinary lines again. You might not expect a scroll to keep track of who blinks first, but the one they whispered about in the House of Life did, and it always won with excessive politeness. The bronze key that let you into the library had learned this habit from the scroll. It turned with a patient sigh, as if to say, "We are beginning again, slowly." Lamps woke like tame stars. Papyrus stiffened with the faintest crackle, the consonant of plants remembering sunshine. The room smelled of hollow reeds and river water, which is to say it smelled of rows and columns arranged into sentences. A scribe checked the day as small institutions. Pens trimmed the width of a careful eyelash, a bowl of water that mirrored whoever leaned over and tried not to look at themselves, a piece of string for counting knowledge one knot at a time. If you're somehow still awake by the time the knots reach 5, you may subscribe to this unfolding list of quiet objects. The string will not mind the company, and I promise the excitement level will remain comfortably horizontal. They called the library per ink the House of Life, though much of its life consisted of silence behaving well. Shelves exhaled dust as evenly as priests gave blessings. A sealed cupboard kept a dignified secret behind a curtain that only moved when a hand did. The morning inventory walked through the room like a soft parade. Spells for headaches that also worked on relatives, hymns tied to the traffic of the sun, receipts for wine that implied the gods were constant but thirsty starless that put order in the ceiling. Every jar of ink had its hour. It was courteous ink, obedient to water, but with opinions. A seal of clay recorded each opening with a little moon of thumbprint, and clay is a candid historian. It told you who had entered, when they pretended not to, and which seal had sighed and forgiven them. Knowledge was counted like grain. That day's share measured out, tied with string, returned to its container, and whispered to sleep. The practice made wisdom feel edible, which in a way it is. The rumor did not begin so much as continue. A visiting student, polite and exhausted, mentioned a scroll that taught the speech of birds and the tongues of fish as if he were describing a neighbor who borrowed cups of silence. Another scribe quietly improved the story with a bit about stone doors that opened when the reader breathed at the right syllable. A third person warned that the reading must never be done twice, and never before noon, not because mornings are fragile, but because mornings have schedules. The formula sounded uncannily like a temple appointment, 1 recitation per soul, daylight half mature, a basin nearby, and please return all mysteries to their original position. Temptation, when it visited, wore the clothes of caution. It waited by the lamp with its best manners, nodding as if to say, it would be a shame to waste all this careful lighting on a harmless myth. The lamp did not engage. Lamps trust habits more than curiosity. To read any dangerous thing safely, the room must be taught to be unsurprised. That is why the stool sits 3 palm widths from the table, not 2. That is why the window is sealed with resin and a conviction about drafts. That is why the bowl of water sits where a nervous elbow cannot reach it, though nervous elbows exist chiefly to find bowls. Breath is measured like steps on a familiar street. The reed pen rehearses its pressure until the reed agrees to make sound instead of protest. A single slip would mean nothing until the meaning hears it and chooses to arrive. Words are released into the air as carefully as boats slide into current. They prefer that. They like to feel that the water is ready to be spoken. The old reader, who had taught his lungs to behave like civil servants, traced each syllable with the tip of the pen before he let it go. He insisted that grammar is simply the posture a sentence uses to meet the world. The House of Life enjoyed this and saved the line for future conversations about shelves. When the scroll is read, birds adjust their attention like bureaucrats who have spotted a news stamp. Swallows report weather in complete clauses and add, for style, a small detour about traffic over the granary. Herons issue minutes with lengthy pauses in which they approve their own elegance. If you know the syntax, you can tell from the order of wing beats whether the wind plans to be punctual. Statues also listen, but in a way that makes the room 1 degree cooler, as if stone absorbs heat to consider the matter. Canals answer when addressed with the right participle. They confess to small, navigable sins, side inlets that the mapmaker left unlabeled because the map had already reached its legal maximum of secrets. Sand confides that it has seen many footprints and would prefer not to testify. Stars respond to names older than maps and seem relieved when someone pronounces them without apologizing. There is a light comedy to all this. Power arrives without noise, puts its coat on the back of a chair, and expects the same courtesy in return. Of course, the text, which is famous for giving, has a budget that balances. Sleep approaches in a sideways manner after such reading. The sleeper's personal name grows heavier, as if its consonants had decided to sit down and not be vowels for a while. A bowl appears on a familiar shelf, a finger's width to the left of where it usually stands, and the difference is felt all day like a small stone in a shoe that is otherwise excellent. Ink seems unwilling to wash entirely from the hand that held the reed. It stays in the intentions of the skin, a tone several shades deeper than soap can reach. Dreams adopt phrases the mouth would not risk twice, and they repeat with the efficiency of an observant clerk. The harshest part is the management of time. The reader's noon alters itself to match the document's sense of noon, which is the unsentimental noon practiced by stars rather than kitchens. Breakfast becomes a flexible sacrament. The punishment is administrative rather than dramatic, which is typical of wise texts and most well-run libraries. Countermeasures, invented at a scholarly pace, tend to resemble hospitality rituals because safety is usually a polite welcome extended to a difficult guest. A basin of water steadies the room. It is a reminder that liquids like equilibrium and dislike surprises. A small bread offering persuades the air to consider generosity rather than jurisprudence. A second voice reads a harmless hymn afterward, not to cancel the first reading, which cannot be done, but to ballast it. Knots are counted aloud when the scroll is tied 3, then 5, and the numbers satisfy something in the wrist. A line is written in a margin that says what cannot be undone, which is at once a condemnation and a lullaby. The margin has its own religion. It believes in limits and writes them carefully because limits, unlike saints, require excellent penmanship. Where to keep an obediently disobedient book is a question that makes every shelf look suddenly small. The river answered with reeds. Reeds like to hide things. It is their vocation and their leisure. A cedar chest tarred, lined with linen that knows the smell of temples, was sunk where the bank held firm. The work was done at a pace agreeable to scorpions, who prefer competence to speed. A star map marked the spot in a chapel ceiling. No 2 stars there were labeled with letters. Instead, small mythic animals took attendance, and one of them, a fish with a thoughtful expression, pointed its fin where only a person with a neck ache would notice. The chest was not called for by schedule. Retrieval was a favor, not a plan. Favors train the future to care for the past without filling out forms. When the chest did surface, which happened rarely, and with the gravity of a ruin in reverse, the linen insisted on being refolded exactly as it had been because linen believes memory is a precise fold that becomes a habit. The House of Life held a bedtime hypothesis in its polite hand. It suggested, without insisting, that some books protect cities by refusing to be present in them. If a text can move doors in stone, the safest door is the one that never receives an invitation. Absence is not a whole, it is a method. Later readers would call this archival strategy, keeping a library in the future. Earlier readers called it putting the box where the river will remember. Forgetfulness acquires a spine and leans on it until even the rumor relaxes. If the scroll is read again, it will be by someone who can count to once with conviction, and then to silence with relief, someone who finds speeches exhausting and margins consoling. If no such person arrives, the chest will remain an ordinary weight in the earth, and the earth will consider it no burden at all. On an otherwise unremarkable morning, a junior scribe asked the old reader how to hold breath without bruising it. The old man, who had spent decades sending words downstream as if releasing turtles, demonstrated. He thumbed the reed as though it were a small oar and invited the breath to sit nearer the spine than the teeth. The junior scribe nodded with the sincerity of someone who understands only the shape of the explanation and, therefore, all of it. He practiced on a simple hymn about bread that never mentioned bread by name, a hymn that disguised practicality as gratitude. The room, glad to be useful, rearranged its quiet so that each syllable found a chair. You will notice, if you have been in rooms like this, that quiet has furniture. Some afternoons the rumor returned with travel stories. A sailor swore that the scroll let a cousin walk underwater and arrive at the other bank with hair aggressively dry. An official claimed that a statue of a falcon pronounced a verdict in a voice like copper struck with polite force. A boy declared that the sand had given back a set of footprints a week after the feet had gone elsewhere, as if the desert too missed someone and was unembarrassed by it. Each tale was accepted with ceremonial skepticism and filed in the library of shoulders. The old reader reminded anyone listening that repetition is the real danger. Once opens a door, twice installs hinges on your calendar. The law felt so reasonable that even curiosity clapped for it. Evenings in the House of Life were gentle administrators. The lamps learned to shrink without complaint, like flamingo feathers trained for modesty. Outside, the Nile tapped the stones with the soft knuckles of habit. Inside, the string counted its knots with a retirement humor. The bronze latch sighed itself shut and then sat contentedly in the small dignity of metal. On nights when the chest had been visited, the smell of tar moved through the room like a thought of boats. The ceiling remembered the star map with a loyalty that made painters proud. If you could have placed your ear against the door and listened, you would have heard the library practicing the sound of being unopened, which is a hymn to civic safety. Years turned with the regular reluctance of a clock that enjoys staying put. The chest waited. The map kept pointing, which is what maps do when they are not being read. A flood came and rehearsed being dramatic, then remembered agriculture and apologized. The House of Life replaced the bowl of water because bowls must retire eventually. The old reader gave his read to the junior and said the pen had learned everything it could from him. He meant, of course, that he had learned everything he could from being the pen's hand. He sat by the sealed window and told it a joke about drafts. The window, loyal to its resin, refused to laugh, which was the correct response. On a late summer night, when the moon had more opinions than usual, 2 people went to the river. They took the star map because tradition enjoys being included. Reeds bowed to the idea of purpose. The chest came up with a sound like a very old person standing. Tar, being dramatic only when insisted upon, yielded. The linen unrolled itself in the slow grammar of patience. The scroll lay there, the plain color of trusted tools, the weight of an answer that does not speak until a question has behaved for a long time. They did not open it. The younger one held it in 2 hands and felt the impulse that ruins afternoons, the impulse to learn everything and then argue with it. The older one felt, as always, the sympathetic pain of repetition and the administrative trouble of altered noon. They wrapped the scroll again with the respect due to dangerous kindness and counted the knots, 3 and then 5, as if stating a simple theorem. Not now, the older one wrote in the margin of the moment, which is the only margin that matters to history. The river rearranged a small wave and called it consent. If you are alert enough to collect lessons, there are a few lying very still on the table. Breath likes posture. Water likes to be consulted. Statues will listen if you speak in their tense. Birds possess a pedestrian understanding of meteorology, but their reports are free and mostly accurate. Sand is sentimental and should not be pressed for details. Stars appreciate pronunciation and reward it by staying where they are, which is incredibly cooperative of them. Time behaves better if you do not make it perform twice, and some books are more useful as promises than as performances. If this sounds like practical piety, that is because the House of Life specialized in practical piety the way bakers specialize in heat, carefully, and with flour on the elbow. As the night drifts, a barge of slow darkness carrying small, respectful noises, the lamp in our story becomes the size of a sesame seed of light. The key returns to its hook and pretends not to watch the door, which is exactly what keys do when they are proud. The string of inventory takes a nap between the first and second knot. The scribe folds his breath away the way one folds a linen cloth on a quiet day. Outside, a Huron says something important using only posture, and a boy practicing flute discovers that the softest notes travel the farthest. The city keeps being the city, which is all we ask of any city at bedtime. We do not solve the rumor. We simply store it where mornings cannot trip over it. We do not defeat the punishment. We follow its grammar until it becomes a courtesy. If you find your own name heavy tonight, let it be. Names grow dense when they have been useful. If a jar has drifted one finger's width from its usual place, accept the lesson and move the jar gently back tomorrow. If your dreams repeat a line you would never say aloud, remember that the mouth sometimes borrows a sentence to see how it fits, the way a library borrows a reader to keep its benches honest. And if you feel your noon moving to meet a clock very far away, think the book that corrected you and then forget where you put that gratitude. Forgetting is part of the method. It keeps the city intact. Somewhere downriver, the chest settles into its shelf, and a scorpion declares the project concluded. The map in the ceiling loses a little dust the way old friends drop a joke to see if anyone notices. The house of life turns on its side, a whole building shifting in its sleep. We breathe as it taught us, not to cast spells, but to keep syllables from bruising. The rumor finds a corner and curls into it like a cat, one eye soliloquizing and then closing. The margin keeps its law in small, neat signs, the only punctuation the night requires. And we let the dimness arrange itself around the day as the day patiently withdraws, as the water keeps its counsel, as the scroll waits to be read. Once by someone who measures time like kindness and stops, as the city learns again that being protected is often indistinguishable from being gently left alone. You might not expect a stick to have an office, a salary, and a public reputation, but the medieval Elwan did, and it kept all three with the grave expression of wood that knows its exact length. The morning light found them where towns kept their certainties, in guild halls, in market arcades, bolted to pillars, chained to posts, sometimes carved in stone along a church porch, the way a parish might publish its theology visually, at eye level, with no room for disagreement. The word for arm in Latin became the word for measure ulna, and then became a neighborhood of small languages, L in English, own in French, L in German, each a little different the way bread is a little different in each village. Some cities made an L the length of a local official's arm and then kept the official long after he had moved away, by which I mean they preserved his arm's opinion in oak. If you're still awake by the time I reach the Flemish L and its complicated cousins, feel free to subscribe or just blink once very slowly in a manner that implies moral support. Both actions are logged by history with the same sleepy enthusiasm. Before the day warmed the stalls, a clerk unlocked a cupboard where the town elf slept. It was a wand of seasoned wood with iron tips, sometimes brass, full of small notches that meant inches before inches had a union. The clerk checked it the way a beetle checks a bell, not by ringing, but by knowing. He touched the metal end against a nail set in the wall beneath a carved crown. Here the crown stood for municipal certainty, a useful monarchy that never argued back. Along the porch, a second L had been cut into stone for reference when tempers ran high or rain smudged memory. Travelers kissed the stone L the way one greets an old scale that never lies, which is to say they kissed it mentally and made a note. There were other lengths, of course. The Scottish L lifted its chin to 37 inches and refused to apologize. The Flemish one, meanwhile, preferred 27 or thereabouts and minded its own trade. A tailor from Brabant might feel taller in Edinburgh without growing at all. Markets found this delightful until money entered the conversation. By the time shutters lifted and sacks sighed their way onto benches, the owl had begun its quiet work, conducting cloth from one side of a table to the other with all the ceremony of a slow river. Only the wand moved. The cloth behaved like a witness who had agreed to cooperate. Sellers loved a long owl and buyers loved a short one. Therefore, towns loved a fixed one. The wand's chain remained visible not because it was dangerous, but because it was respectable. A chain measure says to everyone, the truth is available, but it does not wander. Housewives felt for the notch that marked a half owl and allocated apron futures accordingly. Apprentices learned to slide the wand under the cloth rather than above it, so their fingers could not accidentally breathe length into the air. In some stalls, the L had a small handle that looked like a modest opinion glued to the side. In others, it was simply a staff laid down among dye stains, much as a walking stick rests when a person has arrived. The motion looked priestly: lay, mark, full, lift, repeat. If modern video existed, it would put you to sleep faster than rain. A bell rang to start trading, and then 5 minutes later rang again to remind latecomers that bells, like measures, were not there to be argued with. A friar wandered the aisle explaining that fairness maintained salvation in small quantities. He gestured at the owl like a teacher introduces a loyal chalkboard. A baker passed through with loaves measured in more intimate units. 2 hands. A hearty look. A good smell, but the owl could not help noting that flour sacks were stamped to weight standards too, and that everyone had slowly agreed to believe in numbers the way children believe in bedtime. A merchant from far away produced his own wand, which happened to be longer. It happens with belief systems. The town clerk stood him beside the stone L and smiled the way a wall smiles by remaining a wall. They bartered instead over dye lots and whether the blue looked better in cloudy weather. People adjust to truth as to weather by finding a hat that suits. Now and again, the L held court. A tailor accused a weaver of supplying cloth that shrank during argument. The L was consulted. It declined to comment on humidity, but agreed the edge looked nervous. Judgment landed like a folded sleeve. The weaver would provide a little more than a little, and everyone would remember to measure without emotions. Laws grew around the wand like ivy that had gone to school. Town statutes said the owl must sleep in public and wake in public. Fines waited for any private stick that contradicted the official stick, the way a town finds a rooster for reading the clock carelessly. In one port city, a wandering salesman was sentenced to stand beside the market, L for an afternoon, holding his own deceitful rod above his head. It made a decent picture. Some places nailed counterfeit wands to the Guildhall door with little wooden epitaphs that read, "Here lies an L that tried to be 2." Strange that length could provoke theater, but all standards are theater in the service of peace. Inspectors arrived when the moon felt industrious. They carried small metal rolls tucked into their sleeves like stable secrets. They visited dyers whose vats steamed colorful criticisms and waved the L wands kept in back rooms. Not weighed, measured, but the gesture looked like weighing because what is distance if not weight laid sideways? In London, an iron standard, a bar that had never bought nor sold a yard of anything, slept in the exchequer like a dragon content with its arithmetic. Clerks warmed their hands over it with their eyes, because warmth comes from certainty if you are patient. They compared town wands to the bar and wrote in a book that glowed with ink. This market's L is honest. This one is ambitious. This one needs to visit the blacksmith and confess. The writing itself was a kind of measure, for letters know their wits and keep to them. When a wand proved short by a biscuit's crumb, the inspector chalked it long for the day and came back with a file, a ceremony that tells you everything about medieval optimism. There were specialized elves for narrow trades. A linen owl had a cheerful speed because linen likes to be measured. A silk owl sneaked in an extra breath at each notch, and nobody minded because silk, like cats, adds length by suggestion. Sound makers used an owl that recent rain had complimented, explaining that wind respected consistency in the same way monasteries respect silence. Tanners measured hides with what can only be called persuasion. In a few towns, a second unit called the Nail broke the L into even smaller promises a 16th year. A quarter there so that even frugal souls could order precisely a piece of sleeve and nothing else. Tailors' apprentices learned to count nails the way bakers count scores on loaves, with a knife that writes. One statute forbade the sale of any nail cut at a diagonal. Another law said no L could be carved with secret hollows. Someone, therefore, had tried both, which is how law progresses. One creative disappointment at a time, the L extended itself into language. To take a long L meant to accept temptation from the arithmetic of desire. If one L is good, two must be a triumph. Households spoke of a good L of patience to mean a morning in which the fire would not start and the pot would not agree to be clean. A parish bragged that its porch carried 2 honest L's, a boast both literal and moral. A proverb scolded, give him a nail and he will steal the whole L. Nobody mentioned that giving someone a nail is often an invitation to finish the project. Scribal jokes circulated about scholars who measured arguments by the L and still found they had cloth left over. Somewhere a poet compared love to a bolt of fabric briefly longer than the official wand. The poem was admired, then folded away. Because towns cannot afford to standardize affection, travelers learn to carry conversions in their heads. A Scottish L is nearly a yard and a peck. A Flemish L is friendly but short. A Paris L changes its mind according to the street. And in the Holy Roman Empire, you should ask the market wall before counting anything you care about. Merchants wrote small tables in the back of their account books the way cooks write substitutions for eggs. Some carved the differences along the edge of their walking sticks and pretended the marks meant genealogies. There is comfort in the visible. Pilgrims used the L to measure out ribbon for badges and then, perhaps from piety, added an extra nail because holy images look better when they breathe. Ships carried spare wands alongside spare rope, and a captain could be judged by the straightness of both. Somewhere, a quartermaster adjusted an L to humor a sail that insisted on being almost right. We think of the Middle Ages as a clamor of bells, but truly it was a field of wands lying quietly like well-behaved reeds. Market arguments subsided by noon, when bread distracted everyone with a schedule. Under tables, cats committed informal studies of geometry by sleeping along the L, as if to show how length relaxes. An inspector stopped for ale and trialed his metal rule against the tankard, purely recreationally, because professionals measure things even during their rest. A boy practiced his numbers by counting notches until he reached an answer that felt circular. He asked whether the L worked at night. His mother said, of course, because dreams had edges too. At the far end, a clerk read up fines with such even handwriting that you could see the ruler he had forgotten to remove from beneath the page. Fairness likes props. The sun marked time on the porch owl, and a dog lay in its shadow without caring whether a Flemish dog would be longer. Sometimes the wand failed at diplomacy. A roll of fabric fresh from a distant loom refused to agree to the town's opinion of length, even after polite smoothing. The seller blamed humidity. The buyer blamed foreigners. The L offered to be read again in a slower voice. A compromise involved a discount calculated in nails and an oath that everyone would put their wands on the table next time. One wandering peddler, convinced that geometry admired him, carried an L that could extend with a fiddle of brass. He demonstrated his invention with the glamour of a street conjurer. The crowd admired the mechanism and then escorted him to the porch where the stone owl waited with its patients. The show ended. The fiddled wand retired from public life and was repurposed as a curtain rod, which proves that innovation, like crime, occasionally finds decent work. There were ceremonies for the owl that nobody called ceremonies. At dusk, the clerk wiped the wand with a cloth that had once been new wool, and now remembered everything it had measured. He checked the metal tip for burrs, for small dishonesty. He tapped it gently against the nail under the crown and listened. Judgment should not ring, but sometimes it does, and it is a thin sound like the edge of a plate. The chain was coiled with the tenderness people use for well-trained pets. Notes went into a book about wands sent to be filed long, or filed short, or ornamented with new numerals when the old ones acquired history's blur. The book had a wooden cover and an appetite for dust. When the clerk closed it, the room became suddenly taller, the way rooms do when paper stops absorbing them. Asterisk, asterisk, elsewhere in Europe, standards gathered in treasuries like saints on good terms. In Paris, a staff called the Homme de la Ville leaned against a pillar in the Market of the Innocents, iron-bound, a civic backbone. In Brussels, the elves slept under a picture of the Virgin who, according to local exegesis, approved of exactness. In Nuremberg, a parade of measures hung on chains from a facade, like instruments whose music was arithmetic. Travelers compared their domestic length to these public muses and swore to behave. Not all did, but measures are like weather. They correct you eventually. Centuries passed in which the L did so little that it was considered successful. Then philosophy grew ambitious and proposed that the universe ought to be measured not by arms, but by nature herself, by a fraction of the Earth's meridian. For example, which is a grander arm but less convenient for tailors. The meter arrived with its handsome decimals and its traveling platinum bar, a polite visitor from the Age of Enlightenment who spoke flawlessly in tense. Towns nodded, then kept their old wands chained for a while because habits prefer to retire slowly. For a time, people converted in their heads. So many ells to a yard, so many yards to a meter, depending on which government was speaking and whether the clerk liked his new chart. Eventually, the L, like a good official at the end of a long career, moved to a museum and learned to accept school children. Even in retirement, the wand refused drama. It stood in a glass case with the kind of dignity that polished wood can manufacture out of patience and oil. A card explained that this L was once the law of a town, and that every sleeve, sail, and banner had once negotiated with it. Visitors nodded, photographed the glass, and noticed their own reflections kept the length honest. A docent demonstrated with a replica how merchants used to fold cloth mythically straight. He said the word nail, and someone imagined old hands moving calmly in brisk weather. A tailor in the audience raised a finger and added that modern tape measures still flirt with mood. Linen tape stretches when asked nicely. Steel rules keep tone. Everyone keeps a stone owl in their head, whether they admit it or not. The docent was pleased to be corrected. Museums, like markets, prefer participation to certainty as long as somebody brings a stick. The L endures in phrases. We still talk of giving an inch and watching a mile make plans. We still admire a long-armed bargain and distrust short measures. In kitchens, spoons clink and invent L's out of habit. Recipes compromise by asking for scant cups, which is measurement's poetic register. In warehouses, tape measures recoil like polite snakes into housings that look vaguely municipal. The principle remains the same, one fixed thing for all the variable things to find themselves against. People confess they are not good with numbers, but they can tell you exactly when a curtain is not straight. That is an owl talking from behind the curtain rod, remembering its career with affection. As evening closes the stalls in our market, the chain of the town L makes its soft metal circle, and wood decides to be a tree again for the night. The bell performs the sleep version of ringing. Cats who have never cared for standards except those involving bowls take possession of entire aisles and measure them with naps. The clerk locks the cupboard, and the porch L, cut into stone, glows a little with the day's heat, the way truths do when they have been touched many times but not injured. Somewhere a seamstress counts her nails in her head until the counting becomes a lullaby. Somewhere a weaver wipes a loom beam and tells it that tomorrow will be precisely as long as it needs to be. The town rests as if draped in honest cloth, which is the only kind you can sleep under without dreaming lawsuits. And the wand, satisfied with its arithmetic, lies still and prepares to be exact again in the morning, which is all a public servant hopes for, even the wooden ones. You might not expect a library to keep its most interesting book in a room designed to make everyone a little sleepy, but the Egyptians were practical like that. At the Per-Ankh, the house of life, the day starts at the speed of sand. Lamps whisper. Reed pens lie in rows like well-behaved fish. There is a shelf with a curtain, which is really just an honest way to admit that a shelf sometimes wants privacy. The scribe with the keys counts things in a tone used for crops, prayers, medical charms, star lists, lists about lists. He touches a clay seal on the cupboard door. The seal is small, a quiet lump, but important the way a period is important to a sentence. It keeps today's calm from running into yesterday's excitement. Somewhere in the courtyard, a bronze lodge inhales and exhales, because metal likes to pretend it is an animal when no one argues with it. If you're still awake by the time we reach the part about the bowl of water and the reed flute used to measure syllables, feel very free to subscribe or just set your intention toward future listening. The gods will not audit this decision. Inventory proceeds with the sort of efficiency that would make a modern spreadsheet nod in approval. The house of life is a warehouse for orderly magic, hymns that stay at room temperature, surgical recipes that ask for honey as if that solves most things, a chart of star risings that behaves like a very punctual rooster. Rolls of papyrus are tied with string because string is an ancient confidence trick that works. A young apprentice recites the rules for opening the cupboard. You break the seal only after counting your breaths to 12. You read the title lines to the lamp, not to yourself. You put your hand on the shelf wood and say, "Remain at peace," which sounds excessive until you have spent time with shelves. They appreciate manners. The apprentice speaks carefully because vowels are the sort of neighbors you greet by name. He knows there is a rumor of a scroll that teaches the speech of birds, and the names that unlock doors in stone, and the names that make canals remember where they hid their inlets. The rumor is older than he is and has learned to nap between tellings. A house of life has no sign that says danger. It has a window that is usually closed against surprise breezes, and a stool, and a bowl of water placed at the right-hand edge of the table because knowledge prefers to have a horizon. When the scribe demonstrates the proper posture for reading, he does so like a priest explaining how to hold a very polite cat. He reminds the apprentices of the rule that is almost a proverb: once aloud, never twice, and never before noon. Morning light, they say, carries words too easily. They skitter off like small boats and get ideas. Dusk listens better. A lamp gives the right shape to caution. The older scribes speak of a scroll in the curtain shelf, sealed and resealed, that answers questions so efficiently it punishes curiosity for wasting syllables. A reader with a nervous mouth, they say, may discover that paper can keep receipts. We are not dealing with thunderbolts here. We are dealing with a counting dot before anyone reads. Someone always closes the courtyard gate and slides the iron key as if tucking in a child. The clay seal is lifted. A new one waits in a little basket like a loaf that has not yet agreed to be bread. The scrolls are bundled in colors that mean almost nothing unless you already know them, which is the oldest trick in the archive world. There is a colophon that counts the number of times each roll has been opened. Some bear high numbers, proudly worn, like sandals that have seen a lot of reasonable walking. One roll, though, has numbers written with extraordinary neatness, and not very many of them. The apprentice notices because neatness draws the eye like water draws boats. Beside that count is a tiny sketch of a bird. It is not clear whether the bird guards the roll, insults it, or simply believes in good margins. The scribe doesn't explain. He prefers students to fall asleep with questions. That way the dreams will keep working the night shift. When the reading hour arrives, the lamp is adjusted to a flame that says concentration rather than festival. Breath is measured in small steps. The reed pen is laid close by. Not to write, writing comes later, after the words have cooled, but to weigh the air. In this place, weight is not only for grain. Syllables are also counted with a finger on the reed, like a slow heartbeat. The scribe begins with the title lines, which are not a title so much as a handshake, and the room answers by doing very little. A cat blinks from the threshold like a minor auditor. If a mistake happens, if a word slides into another word, the way river water forgets which bank it, preferred nothing obvious occurs, the mistake simply takes note and waits. This is not a thriller. This is worse. It is administration. The threshold of voice is a real thing here. They keep it visible by putting a small bowl of water on the table. The water is clear when you are below the threshold, and cloudy when you rise above it, not because the voice stirs the surface, but because the mind does. The scribe reads calmly, like someone unwrapping a coil of rope that may see use later. He does not taste the consonants. He holds them with his teeth as if they are guests who might leave soon. He tells the apprentices that a single slip is nothing until meaning notices, which is a remark you can apply to nearly everything, including bread. The room is arranged to limit surprise. There are no drafts, no new shadows. If a gecko clicks from the plaster, everyone takes a breath and counts to 10 as if sending the sound a bell. According to the books, the scroll gives more than instructions. Birds, for instance, do not merely imitate sounds. They change the weather by announcing it correctly. The reader learns the polite way to ask a swallow whether the canal bend is hiding an inlet under its careful mud. A statue, if addressed with the correct number of syllables and the right number of lamp flickers, will not move. Nobody wants that. But it will adjust its attention, which is usually enough. Sand remembers footsteps, but it will remember yours as a recent opinion instead of a conviction. The stars, it turns out, are not aloof. They answer to names that are older than maps. The scribe says these things almost casually, like a baker discussing the temperament of wheat. When the scroll behaves, it resembles a very good map that walks beside you and says nothing unhelpful. Of course, the text has preferences. It likes to be read at dusk. It likes readers who eat almost nothing at midday. It likes a window that is not quite shut, so the river can send quiet through it the way a mother sends a child back to bed. If you ask for a door to open in stone, the scroll might oblige, but it may also make stone think fondly of the door and do nothing else. That is how magic maintains its budget. The scribe explains all this in a tone fit for bedtime. Power arrives without noise and expects the same in return. The apprentices practice under their breath and discover that some sentences are shaped like steps and some like ponds. Every so often the scribe feeds the lamp with a curl of old papyrus trimmed from a repair. Nothing is wasted. Even mistakes serve as good fuel. The price, when it comes, is not a calamity. It is distressingly sensible. The reader who commands birds too fluently finds sleep behaving like a stern librarian. Dreams repeat phrases the mouth would not risk twice. Familiar rooms told by the smallest degree, as though logic has a gentle tide. Ink will not leave the hand that held the reed, even after washing. This is not permanent, merely persuasive. The skin remembers the idea of words. The scribe shows where to scrub and where to let the stain confess itself. A few lines in the scroll are renowned for generosity followed by invoice. A canal will speak to you of a hidden inlet, and then at dinner, salt will taste undecided. The text does not punish wickedness. It punishes carelessness. It wants your attention to pay for the attention it gives. Students learn countermeasures the way sailors learn knots. A basin of water stands ready, not to drown trouble, but to teach it depth. The reader touches the surface and says a short hymn that rhymes with bread, because hunger makes a good anchor. Someone else, not a mirror, but a friendly second voice recites a safe text at the same time. Something about grain measurements or the inventory of temple bolts. This ballast hymn is a beautiful piece of nothing. It keeps the room ordinary while the words do their walking. Afterward, the scroll is rewrapped with knots counted aloud, 3 then 5, which are numbers that sit down nicely. The reed pen is used to draw a simple eye in the margin, not for protection exactly, but as a note to tomorrow. Do not trust today's enthusiasm with tomorrow's handwriting. If a reader insists on repeating a line that should not be repeated, the scroll waits patiently and collects interest. People imagine punishment as thunder. In practice, it arrives like a missed appointment that reschedules itself forever. The reader becomes proficient at arriving wrong. Doors take a moment longer to remember their hinges. Lamps require encouragement about their lives. The scribe quietly assigns that reader to copying medical prescriptions for a month, which is the paper equivalent of walking in a straight line until sense returns. At the end of each copy, the scribe writes a warning in the margin. What cannot be undone is also useful as a note. He speaks this aloud only once because he respects his own advice. In time, the remedy for too much text is less text. The house of life hides the scroll the way a river hides a shelf, plainly but under more water. The cedar chest is tarred and lined with linen that smells faintly of careful sunshine. It is sunk but not lost, where reeds are patient and scorpions act as unenthusiastic security guards. This sounds dramatic. In fact, it is just logistics. Archives meet the weather where it lives. The chest is marked not with a sign that says "do not," but with an alignment of stars whose map is kept at the temple ceiling, next to the diagram for resetting the calendar. Retrieval is a favor owed across years, not a plan. If you want a modern analogy, imagine a password written into the way the light touches a wall at sunset. It is simultaneously public and inconvenient. Asterisk, asterisk. People assume the Book of Thoth is a single roll, but the scribes prefer to consider it a neighborhood of well-behaved texts, any of which can become misbehaved if given too much sugar. When asked whether the scroll is still read, the oldest priest smiles inside his eyes and says, "We like our cities. We let some books become absent. Absent books are remarkably effective. Absence forces memory to take up weight training. The apprentices copy star lists, and their hands grow quiet. The colophon continues counting small, neat numbers. The curtain goes on being a curtain. Once in a rare while, when a season requires persuasion, when canals forget, or statues need reminding, or birds look at storms without comment, the chest comes up, and the roll appears. And someone with a patient voice reads a line at dusk as if telling the evening what it already knows. If a modern visitor were to ask why all this care for one stubborn document, the scribe would point to the reed pen and say that even ink knows how to behave after it leaves the bottle. Words are not the problem. Timing is the problem, and appetite, and that human tickle that says twice must be better than once. The scroll punishes not with force, but with paperwork, delays, missorted sleep, a hand that cannot forget writing. Those are the rituals of a civilization that took spreadsheets seriously long before paper had columns. When we end tonight, we will not wrap things up with a moral. We will blow out the lamp. The bowl of water will remember the moon. The reed will be laid where it can hear dreams. And the chest, somewhere among the reeds, will take on the night's cool and wait for a dawn that will not come calling. Some books, perhaps the polite ones, protect cities by refusing to be present. The house of life breathes out. The curtain settles. The seal receives its little fingerprint like a star of the quieter sort. In the courtyard, the bronze latch sighs again because it enjoys the schedule. The scribe pockets the keys with the ceremony of someone folding away a very small day. He counts the breaths to 12 and locks the door and walks out under a sky that keeps its own lists. It is entirely possible that nothing has happened, and yet everything has been arranged so that nothing happened correctly. You could learn to sleep like this, with rules, with nods, with a bowl of water that knows when to cloud. You could consider that your dreams are a kind of archive that expects returns in good condition. And you could drift gently into a place where birds comment softly on weather and canals recall their inlets. And the lamp within the chest somewhere under reeds stays unlit and content, like a line in a book that has not been read twice. You might not expect a civilization to perfect the art of not opening its mail, but the wax says otherwise. A small stick of beeswax, brown like toast at the edges, could hold a world in place with one quiet press of a ring. Letters arrived folded into themselves like shy birds. They were braided shut with red floss or stabbed through with a paper tongue. Sometimes they wore a lead disc the size of a coin, which was technically a bulla, though it behaved more like an obedient moon. People wrote, and then by habit, by law, by courtesy, they didn't look. The unopened letter sat with the patience of stone fruit. Its silence was not nothing. It was a kind of paperwork. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe, or consider sealing this moment with an imaginary signet and filing it somewhere under later. Either way, the record will show that you were present, and so was the wax. The table for sealing is ordinary. A candle, a stick that we would simply call wax, but which is 17th century. Clerk would name more precisely beeswax married to rosin so it hardens well. Colored with vermilion or lampblack so you can see the promise. There is a spoon occasionally because people like ceremony, and there is a ring because authority also likes costume jewelry. A letter is not an envelope with opinions. It is the envelope. A sheet is folded and refolded until it seems to know fewer words than before. The fold is a kind of editing. The wax drops as a round, warm pupil. The ring goes down. It rises with the satisfaction of a bakery stamp closing the day. You can still smell honey in old seals. Archivists will tell you that the odor is a liar, and you should not inhale the Middle Ages. Still, the nose believes in bees. Around this small volcano of wax, an entire culture develops a talent for restraint. Messengers carry documents in pouches that are legally invisible. In some periods, breaking a seal is closer to breaking a person than to committing a paper crime. The word breach keeps everyone's metaphors tidy. Households keep drawers for unopened letters. Governments keep rooms. There are shipping crates with nothing inside but promise. You think of modern read receipts and realize that we invented them long before a screen. A seal is an ancient checkbox, but it only checks that nobody peeked. It does not report whether the letter ever mattered. Many didn't. The unopened letter is very good at collecting time. Dust agrees to help. The signet ring, when you hold it upside down, looks ordinary. Pressed into the wax, it throws an image that corrects the world. Lions lie down in mirror writing. Crowns face the useful direction. The motto that reads, "I keep my secrets," reads proudly backward on the ring and properly forward in the wax. A small reversal that never stops feeling like a magic trick. A household might share a ring. A notary might guard a box of them the way a library guards reading lamps. There is red tape, actual red tape spooling from bundles of official papers, soft as ribbon, stern as routine. People cut the tape and then tie it again. You see where the metaphor came from, and also why it refuses to retire. Weeks go by while the wax keeps its miniature discipline. Letters wait, and they are not impatient. Nobody practices speed opening. Knives are for fruit and twine. A clerk might hold a letter up to a lamp to learn nothing, because paper prefers thick skin for secrets. He might weigh the sheet on his palm and decide it contains 3 pages, the way one can tell the number of coins in a pocket by listening. The unopened letter teaches these skills and then offers them no reward. This is not a failure. Not opening is an action. In some households, the stack of sealed documents is the proof of tranquility. If the seals are unbroken, nothing irreversible has happened. It is almost the opposite of news dot. There are small turbulences. Morning seals come in black. They are honest in the plainest possible way. Some wax is perfumed, which makes it a kind of social trap. You imagine the text inside smells as good as the messenger. A papal letter arrives with a lead bulla stamped with saints. It looks so satisfying you could wear it as a pendant. Instead, you put it in a drawer and write it down in a ledger. Counting occurs. Thank yous are composed to the unopened letter for taking the trouble to arrive. Routine is the point, and routine doesn't care whether it learns anything. Not opening has methods. There is the custody seal, a seal placed across several sheets at once so that existence is proved collectively. There is the blank endorsement, a note written on the outside that confidently describes a message nobody has read. A practice we continue when we label boxes winter sweaters and then discover old tax papers. There is letter locking, which sounds dramatic, but is mostly origami with a sense of responsibility. Some folds turn the letter into a small padlock. Others tuck a paper tongue under the wax like a dog's ear under a nap. These structures say, respectfully, that the message has already taken care of itself. The recipient need not fuss with truth, asterisk, in chambers and chancelleries. Notaries develop their own calligraphy for outer panels, to be opened in the presence of so-and-so, which is less a command than a schedule. The presence, when it appears, tends to be a man with a chair. He sits, someone warms a wafer, the seal breaks with the soft cough of cool tar, and the paper is read as slowly as accounts deserve. If the presence is delayed, the letter waits unspoiled. We once built food this way. Then we tried it with information. We invented the pantry of news. The unopened letter could still change a day. It is amazing what a folded sheet can do by simply existing. It can prove that a tax was collected, that a ship sailed, that a marriage was proposed strongly and then delayed gently. Courts accept the unbroken seal as if it were testimony with excellent handwriting. A messenger can claim safe conduct because the packet he carries has not yet been questioned. It is a sort of diplomatic halo that fades only when the wax becomes a memory. You could accuse someone of many things, but if the seals on their papers were intact, they were at least innocent of curiosity. That counted for more than you would think. Households divided labor by silence. The master might be allowed to break business seals. The mistress might be sovereign over the household packet, which contains receipts and recipes, and the one truly effective instruction: do not boil the milk twice. Children were warned not to touch the warm wax because it remembered fingerprints like a jealous god. Yet there are stories shabby, believable stories of teenagers pressing their signet rings into soft bread and making counterfeit seals, decent enough to get them through boring afternoons. The penalty for such ingenuity was usually more chores, which seems correct. The unopened letter traveled comfortably, and coaches it rode with parcels of tea as if they were cousins. At sea, it nested in oiled cloth and lead-lined chests that kept weather at a respectful distance. There were pigeon post experiments in which messages flew without wax and disappointed everyone by being too efficient. There were balloon letters that went wherever the wind pointed because the wind had very little respect for postal districts. The unopened letter was tolerant of these innovations. It enjoyed motion as long as it could continue to promise nothing. It should be said that sometimes the unopened letter hid mischief. Spies loved seals. They had tricks, steam, thin blades, second seals prepared in advance and pressed between damp cloths to soften the wax. They admired themselves for this work and wrote guidebooks whose main lesson, if we are honest, is that even clever people keep envelopes in their ovens. But in the grand accounting of history, secrecy spent more hours practicing patience than performing stunts. A nation can live on bread and vow not to slice it until guests arrive. It is not efficient. It is hospitable. Museums now keep sealed letters as artifacts of decision rather than content. They are records of restraint. You can stand in front of a glass case and count how many times a family said later and actually meant it. Some letters are opened by technology that reads the creases of folded paper like a topographical map and virtually unrolls them. Science becoming the friend who opens things for you because your hands are busy with dessert. Even then, archivists restamp the image of the seal in the catalog so the ghost of the promise can sit where it belongs. We are meticulous with our ghosts. The unopened letter had a second life in offices that specialized in losing mail on purpose. The dead letter office is the most honest building a government ever named. Inside, clerks sorted sealed hopes from unsealed ones. They shook packets gently and listened for coins, because money makes more noise about its presence than words do. Some letters were returned with apologies that resembled recipes. Take one envelope. Add regret. Simmer for a season. Many were pulped. Paper loves reincarnation. It becomes blank by profession. There were also auctions where unclaimed mail was sold in bundles, a thrift store for narratives. Buyers opened them and found nothing scandalous, which is to say everything true, socks, catalogs, sturdy declarations of please advise. In a quiet revolution, envelopes took over the task of being the outside of a letter so the letter could relax. Paper manufacturers began to sell pre-gummed flaps that behave like birds trained to peck only once. Wax grew ceremonial, falling back to weddings and treaties and emergency doses of drama. Signet rings retired to jewelry boxes where they dreamed of hands. A few stalwarts insisted on sealing their bills in wax, which made accountants sad. With the telephone, the unopened letter experienced a mild slump, the way a staircase grows reflective when an elevator is installed. Still, the letter kept its dignity. It knew that a voice leaves less debris than paper. There is a modern way to not open letters. It involves folders marked later, which now live as icons and enjoy the same light diet of attention. We tag emails with small colored dots that do not actually stop us from clicking. We archive. We snooze. We practice digital letter locking by putting passwords on documents whose contents are mainly lunch plans. The skill has not vanished. It has migrated. Somewhere, a server room is a house of life for unread things. The air is cool. The lamps blink. A technician knows the smell of hot dust as intimately as a clerk once knew warm wax. If we were to design a perfect evening of archival calm, we would bring a wooden table, a candle that is committed but not ambitious, a stick of sealing wax with a notch carved by someone who waited out a winter, and a small bowl for water because water keeps people honest. We would fold a sheet purely for demonstration. We would press a ring with a borrowed crest, a lion, a thistle, a star. Then we would decide, in a whisper that barely believes in its echo, not to open the thing we just made. It would be a luxury of slowness, like letting tea cool all the way and still calling it tea. We would watch the seal harden. We would feel time approve. Shelves have memories when you tie the right string. Archivists bundle letters again and again, using soft tape and firmer twill, writing on the outside in pencils that never learn to shout. The string is the varsity sport of patience. It gives the shelf the look of a conscientious bakery. Labels are clipped on like small flags. Correspondence unopened, pending the presence of Mr. Such and Such. The presents may never arrive. That is fine. The bundle performs presence for him. It becomes a stand-in for attention, the way a coat hung on a chair can convince a room that a person is only briefly elsewhere. We should also mention the minor industry of seal repair. Time is rough on wax. It chips the way old toffee chips. Conservators mix tiny batches of new material to fill losses, and they retouch with pigments that smell faintly of kindergarten. These repairs are not deceptions. They are prosthetics for symbolism. The image, the crest, or the saint, or the official squiggle that means, "This is not for you, not yet," is allowed to remain legible after the body has taken its share. The philosophy is gentle. Do not make it new. Make it understandable. The repaired seal is a soft-spoken teacher. People who manage unopened letters are good at naps. The job trains you. Reading can be caffeinated. Not opening persuades you to operate in tea. The mind learns to idle without stalling. You become skilled at placing a thing in a future without losing it in the present. Some call this procrastination. Archivists call it a word plan. The unopened letter is the patron saint of later, and later is frequently where better decisions live. Tucked into drawers beside commas and extra string. When you have listened long enough, the mailroom becomes a tiny school of ethics. You realize that the choice to wait is not the same as the failure to act. The unopened letter kept cities less nervous by giving officials something to postpone properly. Delay, done right, is a public service. An atmosphere of carefully preserved latency is surprisingly restful. The air is full of possibilities that have agreed not to jostle. You can hear the candle think, "Dot, if we end anywhere tonight, let it be in a small office where the windows darken at the same time every day, and the seal press sits upside down when not in use, trusting wax to bring out its good side." There is a ledger, of course. There is a drawer with string sized by the fistful, a delight forever. There are packets that 2 centuries ago belonged to people who traveled by the confidence of horses, and today belong to no one in particular, which is almost a form of democracy. A clerk notes, in a hand that has enjoyed its lunch, "Received, filed, not opened." This is enough. It counts as care. And so the practice continues in minor ways. We wait to read until the right light. We drift toward later like a kettle toward a simmer. The seal cools. The house quiets. Somewhere, a museum storeroom breathes out through climate controls. Somewhere, a private letter waits under a folded handkerchief in a shoebox that once sold shoes to a cousin. Somewhere, a ring that once pressed lions presses against velvet and is not unhappy. You close your eyes and picture a tiny circle in wax turning solid. You imagine its temperature as an instruction. Warm, then less warm, then done. You could open it. You don't. The night approves, and the unopened letter, perfect at last, keeps the room drowsy by simply promising tomorrow. You might not expect the smallest picture in a book to be the boss of the whole volume, but a bookplate does have managerial instincts. It sits there, rarely larger than a playing card, and announces where the book lives, to whom it swears a sort of paper allegiance, and sometimes which shelf is its usual bed. The book may contain thunderous arguments or recipes for nettle soup. The plate remains serene and adhesive. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you may subscribe, or you can simply imagine pasting today gently into tomorrow with a dab of library paste. Either option will be recorded in the accession register of your dreams, somewhere between minorly notable and in very good condition. Edges a little dusty. In the beginning, ownership marks behaved like quiet graffiti. Monks wrote, "This book belongs to Saint so-and-so, and whoever steals it will be, well," the threat got rather imaginative, involving curses that sounded administrative. The ink was brown and patient. Sometimes a small chain was riveted to the binding, making the book literally stationary, the original desktop computer. But even in those rooms of murmuring parchment, the urge to label grew. A name written on the first leaf was the prototype of a book plate, and it had all the drama a name can carry when you also own a quill. The letters widened into calligraphic weather. The book agreed silently to be located. Then someone invented printing, and book ownership became a hobby that wanted stationery. Enter the ex libris from the books of printed on little slips and glued, into place with paste that smelled faintly of wallpaper and slightly of optimism. Early plates used woodcuts. Heraldry marched in with tiny lions who understood shelving, unicorns who tolerated dust, and mottos that promised fidelity to learning while hinting at dinner. There were plates with skulls to remind the reader to finish the chapter today rather than wait for a theoretical tomorrow. There were plates with allegorical ladies doing classical things among vines, and there were plates that were just neat boxes for a name because minimalism is also an era. The plate's job was clear: be small, be certain, be unignorable to anyone tempted to borrow indefinitely. Paste itself deserves a paragraph, and it will have one as slowly as it likes. Proper library paste could be wheat starch boiled into a translucent calm and then cooled until it believed in work. Recipes added clove oil because cloves discourage mold, and because clove oil is the sort of perfume bureaucracy deserves. The paste jar wore a brush like a little haircut. Librarians kept it covered with wax paper that developed fascinating wrinkles. If a plate lifted at the corners, a dab would settle it. If a plate went uncrooked, a gentle slide helped. If it went on very crooked, the book simply acquired a personality that future catalogers described as plate askew, charming. The only rule a plate could not break was detachment. Falling out was unprofessional dot in private libraries. Plates became a way of practicing identity without conversation. You could choose oak leaves, implying sturdiness, or an armillary sphere, implying astronomy even if your telescope lived in a box with Christmas ornaments. Or, in a pleasingly candid moment, an open safe implying one hoped for returns on a robust investment. The tiny art invited a tiny arrogance. A notable printer used a plate where the sun literally shone out of his press. Another collector preferred a bulldog sitting on a book, which is still the best summary of vigilant possession. There were plates engraved with full architectural fantasies, staircases that led to galleries, that led to more staircases. So the reader moved through paper rooms in order to reach the paper rooms. One did not, strictly speaking, need these engravings. The book already contained something to read. But need has always been a distant cousin of stationery. Circulating libraries joined the conversation by declaring that books were citizens who carried paperwork. A pocket made of paper, of course, sometimes color-coded by decade, was pasted to the back-end paper. It held a borrower's card, ruled with tiny marching dates. Near the front lived a stamp that said, "Due," and a small square that said, "This book will be recataloged as absent if not returned by Saturday." The book plate up front was the passport. The pocket was the visa, and the date stamp was customs insisting you declare your time. In shopfront libraries with creaking floors, clerks worked the machine rhythm of stamping. Arm down, date forward, arm up, card out next. Readers loved the noise, or being polite, learned to love it. It told the room that history was accruing in neat increments. Some borrowers signed the cards so elegantly that the book seemed to be practicing penmanship of its own. Ink for stamping had a stubborn character. It sought the page and then the world. You can recognize old library blue by its decisiveness. The rubber stamps, if they were new, carried like a bouquet a faint rubber plant smell, a botanical miscommunication that happens to be comforting. Older stamps kept a record of every date they'd ever met. ghosted across the surface, so when pressed, the new number arrived with uninvited friends in gray. This never bothered a librarian. A smudge date is still a date, just a little more inclusive. And sometimes a stamp called withdrawn hit the page with a square satisfaction, as if the book were checking out of a hotel, having paid its bill in full, ready for a new career on a charity shelf. Academic book plates turned technical. They included call numbers printed right on the label, where their clean fractions looked like biscuits stacked on a saucer. There were plates that said gift of, because generosity likes stationery too. Some institutions added a blind stamp, an embossed seal pressed into the paper with no ink, like waking footprints in snow, to reassure future antiquarians that both book and plate preferred to stay together. In a few libraries, the plate became a map. A small plan of the building appeared north stacks, south stacks, an elevator drawn as a friendly box, and a dot told the reader where the book slept at night. It was oddly moving, knowing that a novel about icebergs lived in aisle 13B, upper left. You could visit it. You could wave. All this labeling needed ledgers, of course, and ledgers liked being useful so much that they multiplied. One recorded gifts. One recorded purchases. One recorded binding work completed by the binder who favored brown half-cloth with marble boards, a style that sounds like lunch. Another listed plates themselves, supplier, quantity, cost, remarks. New order slightly glossy, but acceptable. On a winter afternoon, an acquisitions clerk might sit with 3 ledgers open in a drapery of paperwork, adding numbers that were perfectly happy to be small. The ink dried in a shallow shine that watched the room calmly. There's nothing so sleepy as a calculation that requires no opinion. Bookplates also drew pictures of reading that were aspirational by design. A gentleman sits in a chair large enough to vote. A lady reclines with a lap full of folio, a position that is athletic if you ask the spine. A child gazes at a globe, as if receiving mail from the equator. Cats are present in more plates than you would predict, positioned on open volumes as if they were employed as paperweights by people with romantic ideas about fur. In one fine example, a fox studies geometry. In another, a bookshelf is arranged like an organ. The pipes are books, and the implied music is alphabetical. To place such a plate in a thin handbook of home plumbing is not hypocrisy. It is courage. When books traveled, the plate served as the luggage tag. There was a silent agreement that a volume with an ex libris should eventually return. The way a hat labeled Hall ought not to settle down in Jones. Shipping boxes wooden, with string that had ambitions of rope carried multiple book plates at once. The small heraldry gathering like stamps at a philatelist tea. In an era when rail timetables were the most literary thing many stations printed, the labels reminded everyone that paper commuted. Some institutions pasted a second plate on the inside back cover for long journeys. If a book were open upside down, the claim would still be legible. Ownership, the plate suggested, is a matter of compass as much as street address. Not all plates were deliberate. There were shadow plates where a book plate used to be. The rectangle remained, a paler ghost on a slightly tanned page. Edges crisp where the paste protected fibers, center faintly sticky like memory. Auction catalogs mention these as evidence of plate removed, which is the politest way to describe amateur exorcism. Librarians are rarely indignant about such ghosts. The mark is part of the book's travel history. A new plate can be pasted over the old shadow with a calm that feels almost parental. You have a past, little book. It is welcome here. There is also the thrillingly dull history of classification marks engraved on plates. Even the Dewey Decimal System, which promises a universal order with the sincerity of a bakery promising bread, found itself squeezed onto labels. A tiny decimal point became as significant as a front door. The number 636.8, which means cats, sometimes sat directly on a cat-decorated plate, which would have pleased everyone involved. The professions found their corners. Medicine leaned toward the 610s like a person, choosing a seat near the aisle. Engineering settled in the 620s with pockets full of washers. Literature occupied extensive premises between 800 and 899, as politely as a long family taking up 3 pews at once. Book plates grew to accommodate these numbers, and then quietly shrank again when somebody realized that a pencil could do the same work on the title page with less paste. Some plates announced rules in a voice that could sell. Umbrellas to a cloud. Reading rooms are for reading. Books do not respond well to rain. Please do not annotate with meat gravy. These are nearly direct quotations. They sound obvious until you remember the number of lunches that have unfolded near pages. One library asked readers to turn leaves carefully, which is correct horticulture applied to paper. Another advised, do not cut pages, for they do not grow back. Humor in libraries is of the soft chuckle variety. The plate is its stage. Collectors evolved a sport of trading impressions of book plates. Albums appeared with pages devoted to ex libris specimens, annotated in the margin with notes like engraved by H with admirable stipple, 1834, or gift from M, who files the paste brush to a point. The album was itself a book of book plates, a self-portrait in adhesive mirrors. In these gatherings, the smallest decisions, how much white space to leave, whether to include a motto at all, were debated with the gravity usually reserved for borders on maps. One enthusiast maintained that a book without a plate was still a book but also an opportunity wasted. Like a door without a bell, the 20th century brought rubber-cemented speed, then self-adhesive plates that required only the courage to peel. Librarians, being loyal to the sensible, admired pressure-sensitive adhesives the way gardeners admire hoses that do not kink. The jar of paste did not retire exactly. It drifted toward conservation work and fond memory. Children's books received cheerful plates with lines for "This book belongs to," the handwriting of ownership beginning in thick, hopeful pencil. In school libraries, embossed labels performed security theater. If you could feel the seal under your thumb, the book was both safer and somehow prouder. Meanwhile, the opposite practice erasing needed tools of its own. Withdrawn stamps, duplicate labels, a tiny bottle of solvent to release a plate when a book changed careers. Solvent smelled like a clean hallway. It lifted the plate with a slow sigh, a sound you could hear only if you believed in paper's breath. Removed plates might be archived in files under the donor's name, because a plate is sometimes the only enduring biography a book ever receives. There is something elegant about a drawer full of tiny identities, resting in alphabetical order, mutual acquaintances, and a long, quiet party. Digital cataloging arrived with noises that books do not make. Beeps joined shushes. Barcodes landed on the end papers like sponsored caterpillars, striped, forward-thinking. The barcode is the bookplate's cousin who went to engineering school and now speaks fluent beep. It records not where the book ought to live, but how fast it moves. Yet most institutions kept the old ex libris in parallel. It turns out the human eye enjoys a declaration in ink and paper that simply says, "You are here," the print equivalent of the red dot on a mall map. Without the pressure to find shoes. What today does a bookplate actually do? It keeps promises small and fulfilled. It tells a finder where to bring a wanderer. It thanks a donor in a size that never interrupts chapter 1. It guesses that a book and a room are better together than apart. It also, rather charmingly, keeps design alive for the quietest corner of the page. Graphic designers get to make heraldry for people who mainly want to read in peace. That is a lovely commission. The modern minimalist plate, just a name and a friendly typeface above a line, may not roar like a lion rampant, but it purrs with "You stop now," and then a plate becomes the star of a detective story without any actual detectives. A book turns up in a box of miscellaneous household history at a yard sale. Inside, a plate declares, "From the library of," and includes an address that is now a cafe. Someone looks up the name. The cafe owner remembers a postcard in a drawer. A greyhound appears with a biscuit tin of letters. The book drifts back toward the family, which doesn't solve a crime, but does put a small piece of furniture back where it fits. Nothing dramatic has happened. Everything appropriate has dot. There are plates that commemorate events as small as Tuesdays. Cataloged the 14th of April, a stamp might say, and suddenly April is real forever. There are plates printed during wartime on scratchy paper that did not want to be fancy. Plates from bookshops that also repaired umbrellas. Plates from subscription libraries in towns where the railway platform was longer than the list of surnames. Some plates arrive pre-numbered, a tiny press working through 001 to 999 with the confidence of a metronome. The book waits patiently to learn which number it will be. It accepts the identity with the equanimity of a coat accepting a new button. When plates meet disaster flood, time, a child's profound love of stickers conservation staff step in. They humidify with a seriousness that water rarely inspires. They float plates off pages to save both. They reattach with paste the consistency of a well-mannered cloud. The process is slow because the goal is not heroism but legibility. Afterward, the book holds its plate like a sailor holds a postcard, gently, and with the intention to keep it dry dot in homes. Book plates are still handwriting with backup singers. Some are pre-printed. Many are made from shelf paper cut into little fields for names. People paste them crooked, and it is fine because crooked is how affection behaves on paper. The book that lived near the kitchen acquires a plate with faint pepper at the edge. The one that lived by the bed has a plate you can feel through the dust jacket like the calmest heartbeat. When the books move houses, the plates ride along, acting as old forwarding addresses that still deliver comfort. Not every plate is for possession. Some say ex dono, from the gift of, so that the book becomes an ongoing thank you note. Some say in memory, which is another kind of gift, one that keeps its shoes on and its tone gentle. The text may be a name alone, or a name with years, or a phrase that repeats the book's theme softly, like an echo in polite stone. A cookbook donated in memory of an enthusiastic soup maker earns a plate that smells, if you're willing, faintly of bay leaf. The poetry section hosts plates that use italics as if italic were a room tone. The effect of these inscriptions is cumulative. A library full of them reads like a town introducing itself. There is an etiquette to reading another person's plate. You look because that is what it is for, but you do not narrate. You notice the motto and do not test it. If the plate has a coat of arms, you admire the hedgehogs. There are surprisingly many hedgehogs, and refrain from genealogical speculation unless invited. If the plate is plain, you appreciate the restraint. When you return the book, you avoid peeling. It is not difficult etiquette. It is simply the practice of leaving a small declaration undisturbed. Late at night, a library grows louder in small, meaningful ways. Air systems hum. Pages adjust the way wood adjusts, microscopic courtesy creaks. In that sound, book plates are busy doing nothing visible. They hold history to cardboard. They tell call numbers where their day will begin. They promise donors that the gift still looks like a gift. 1,000 tiny labels, asleep on the job and therefore excellent at it. Sometimes one corner lifts, a little wing. In the morning, someone will bring paste with clove and persuade the wing to rest. The ledger will record repaired plate, East Reading Room. Weather cloudy, because weather gets into everything eventually. If there is a hypothesis to take to bed, it might be this. The smallest marks are the most restful because they worry least about being noticed. A book plate does not perform. It locates. It says from the library of, and then points forever. Readers come and go. Debits and credits happen to the budget. New barcodes acquire adhesive confidence. Classification systems update like moon phases. The plate remains. It performs a magic in slow motion, turning a book into an address. When you close a volume and feel that tiny firmness under your fingertips, the slight rise where paper was added to paper, you were touching an agreement. Not a rule, exactly. A place. You can sleep there for a while if you like. The shelves will remember. The plate will handle the paperwork of dreaming.